The Chicago Women's School of Sociology is a term used to describe the network of women who worked to produce a body of sociology that linked social theory, sociological research, and social reform. The body of work that was produced by these women occurred primarily between 1890 and 1920, and it was largely based out of the University of Chicago, where many of them attended graduate school, and Hull House, which we learned about in our chapter on Jane Addams, and it was a settlement home organized to improve the condition of the working poor in the area. The dynamic between Hull House and the University of Chicago proved to be a great success. From it, the women involved in the project were able to incorporate social theory that they learned at the university while gaining practical experience outside in urban Chicago and its surrounding counties. In fact, women like Florence Kelley were able to take their experiences at Hull House and the University of Chicago and apply them in New York City at the Henry Street Ward Settlement House. The women that we'll discuss in this chapter are EDITH Abbott, Grace Abbott, SOPHONISBA BRECKINRIDGE, Florence Kelley, Frances Keller, Julia Lathrop, Annie Marion MACLEAN, and Marion Talbot. EDITH Abbott was born in 1878 in Grand Isle, Nebraska. Her father was the only lawyer in town, and he was a soldier in the Union Army and an abolitionist. Her mother was an important leader in the suffrage movement and even friends with Susan B. Anthony. Edith went to college at the University of Nebraska, and her family couldn't afford to send her to college due to a drought that struck Nebraska and eventually led to an economic depression. So instead of going to college immediately, Edith taught high school in her hometown and took night classes until she was able to afford to fully enroll in college. She enrolled at the University of Nebraska, receiving her degree in 1901, and then continued teaching for 2 more years after she graduated. Eventually, Edith was awarded a graduate fellowship to the University of Chicago, where she earned her doctorate in political economy in 1905. While at the University of Chicago working on her PhD, she met Professor SOPHONISBA BRECKINRIDGE. Later, Abbott and Breckinridge would publish multiple studies while at the Chicago School of Civics and Philanthropy. In 1906, Abbott received a Carnegie Fellowship and continued her studies at the University College of London and the London School of Economics. She learned from social reformers Sidney Webb and Beatrice Webb, who championed new approaches to dealing with poverty. The Webbs influenced the direction of Abbott's career, and they were in favor of repealing the British Poor Laws, which they viewed as demeaning to people in poverty, and they supported establishing programs to eliminate poverty. While studying in London, Edith lived part of the time in a social reformer settlement house in a poverty-stricken area of the East End, where she gained experience in social work. Abbott returned to the United States in 1907 after her years studying in London and moved into Jane Addams's Hull House with her sister Grace. At that time, Hull House was renowned as a mecca for educated women and for its vibrant community of residing revolutionary thinkers. Grace and Edith Abbott became great additions to the reform-minded community as they contributed significantly through their commitment to social reform advocacy and scholarship of statistical research. In Chicago, Grace took a job teaching economics at Wellesley College, and though her job was highly regarded for a woman with a PhD at the time, she wanted to return to the University of Chicago. She got her chance in 1908 when SOPHONISBA BRECKINRIDGE, then director of social research at the independent Chicago School of Civics and Philanthropy, offered her a job teaching statistics in the Department of Social Investigation. The long-lasting professional partnership between Grace Abbott and Breckinridge first started during their years together at the School of Civics and Philanthropy. They shared a common interest in detailed statistical investigations of contemporary social problems, which they believed they could use to spark reform advocacy. With the joint efforts of Abbott and Breckinridge, in 1920, the University of Chicago's Board of Trustees voted to rename the school the University of Chicago Graduate School of Social Service Administration. It was the first graduate school of social work in the country affiliated with a major research university. Abbott was hired as an associate professor of social economy and was named dean in 1924. She became the first U.S. woman to become the dean of an American graduate school, and along with Breckinridge, transformed the field of social work by emphasizing the importance of formal education in social work and the need to include field experience as part of the training. They designed a curriculum that heavily emphasized social statistics as the historical, legal, economic, and political root causes of social problems and public welfare efforts. In addition, they fought for the professional status of social work. The curriculum that EDITH devised, a broad background in economics, statistics, government, legislation, and history, set the standard of social work curriculum today. ABBOTT was also a prominent immigration expert, and she worked for reforms that would end exploitation of immigrants. She was appointed chair of the Committee on Crime and the Foreign-Born of the Wickersham National Commission on Law, Observance, and Enforcement. Through her advocacy, she wrote in scholarly articles, book reviews, and governmental reports, in which she discussed issues such as women's and children's rights, crime, immigration, and public assistance. She also stressed the importance of a public welfare administration, the need for a more humane social welfare system, and the responsibility of the state in addressing social problems. In 1939, the death of Edith's sister Grace caused her to become lonely, and slowly she began to withdraw herself from public life. In 1941, she published her final book, Public Assistance, and in 1942, she officially retired as the Dean of the School of Social Service Administration. EDITH spent her remaining years living with her family in their home in Grand Isle, Nebraska, where she died of pneumonia in 1957. Grace Abbott was born in 1878 in Grand Isle, Nebraska, along with her sister, EDITH. And after graduating from Grand Isle Baptist College in 1898, Grace taught high school in her hometown. She left Nebraska in 1908 at age 29 to attend the University of Chicago, where she planned to study law. She ended up staying at Hull House, and during a time of widespread anti-immigrant sentiment, she served as director of the Immigrants Protective League from 1908 to 1917. She defended asylum seekers from deportation, testified in court against the trafficking of women, and lobbied against policies meant to exclude non-English-speaking immigrants. In 1921, she became the director of the U.S. Children's Bureau, making her the highest-ranking woman in government. Her mission was to enforce a new law to keep children under 16 out of dangerous work environments. Perhaps her greatest achievement was a societal recognition that children are citizens, and this entitles them to certain basic rights. She faced opposition from families that relied on their children's earnings and business owners that relied on their cheap labor. She was also instrumental in enforcing a 1921 Maternity and Infancy Act, which was the first federally funded social welfare program. The mortality rate during that time was very bad, and part of Grace's work was educating the public on why babies and women were dying. Her programs provided midwife training, open healthcare clinics for mothers and babies, and advocated for breastfeeding, but this was met with deep opposition from conservative circles. So Grace was both adored and bitterly attacked. She was attacked violently throughout her life, and statements on the floor of the Senate House called her a menopausal maniac or someone with a Mussolini complex. These insults came from both men and women, but particularly a group of women called the Women Patriots, who were opposed to women gaining the right to vote, with whom Grace had a lifelong battle. Grace resigned from the Children's Bureau in 1934, but she continued working on drafts of the Social Security Act until it was passed the following year. Grace was also the first woman in American history to be nominated to a presidential cabinet post, Secretary of Labor in the Hoover administration. Her nomination was very controversial. It was supported by civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois and resisted by Hoover himself. Grace eventually became the editor of the Social Service Review and taught social work at the University of Chicago, where her sister EDITH was the first female graduate school dean in the country. Neither of the sisters married, and so they lived together until 1939, when Grace died of cancer at age 60. Her primary achievements were in the realms of immigrant rights, children's rights, and women's rights. She was one of the greatest champions of children's rights in American history, and her work has been credited with leading the way to the creation of the Social Security program and the United Nations' UNICEF program. She was a lifelong Republican Party member and a lifelong liberal activist. She spent much of her adult life in the poorest immigrant neighborhoods of urban Chicago, and she was even nicknamed the mother of America's 43 million children. SOPHONISBA Breckinridge was born in 1866 in Lexington, Kentucky. She was a member of the politically active and socially prominent Kentuckian elite, the Desha family, and the Breckinridge family. She was the second child of 7 of Isa Desha Breckinridge, the second wife of Colonel William C. P. Breckinridge, a member of Congress from Kentucky, an editor and a lawyer. At 14, she attended the Kentucky Agricultural and Mechanical College, later called the University of Kentucky, where it opened to women in 1880. She wasn't allowed to be degree-seeking, but she studied there for 4 years. Breckinridge graduated from Wellesley College in 1888 and worked for 2 years as a high school teacher in Washington, D.C., teaching mathematics. She traveled in Europe for the next 2 years, finally returning to Lexington in 1892 when her mother suddenly died. She studied the legal system in her father's law office, and in 1895 she became the first woman to be admitted to the Kentucky bar. Since Breckinridge had few clients who would hire a woman lawyer, she left Kentucky to become a secretary to MARION Talbot, the Dean of Women at the University of Chicago. She enrolled as a graduate student, eventually receiving a PhD degree in 1897 and a PhD in political science and economics in 1901 from the University of Chicago. She was appointed in 1902 as Assistant Dean of Women of the university, and the next year she was hired as an instructor. In 1904, she became the first woman to graduate from the University of Chicago Law School. When she came to the University of Chicago in 1895, Breckinridge formed a close relationship with the Dean of Women, Marion Talbot, and a small packet of letters from the summer of 1936, written by Breckinridge to Talbot, suggest that the two had a romantic relationship. However, while many of the Chicago women enjoyed passionate relationships with one another, it's not clear whether this was romantic or whether it emerged from the dominant Victorian culture that idealized closeness between women, coupled with women's celibacy and self-sacrifice. Although she remained close to Talbot throughout her life, by the 1910s her primary relationship was with Edith Abbott, and it's unclear whether Breckinridge and Abbott's relationship was romantic or platonic. Breckinridge and Abbott worked together closely at the School of Social Service Administration, and the pair also promoted social welfare policy. Breckinridge and Abbott played an important role in designing, promoting, and implementing several New Deal programs, including the Social Security Act of 1935, which laid the groundwork for the modern welfare state. A lifelong advocate of maximum hour and minimum wage legislation, Breckinridge also helped promote the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. Florence Kelley was born in 1858 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Her father was a self-made man who became an abolitionist, a founder of the Republican Party, a judge, and a longtime member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Kelley was influenced mainly by her father and said, "I owe him everything that I have ever been able to learn to do." Throughout her early years, he read books to her that involved child labor. Kelley had 2 brothers and 5 sisters, but all 5 sisters tragically died in childhood. So Kelley was an early supporter of women's suffrage after her sisters died and worked for numerous political and social reforms, including the NAACP, which Kelley helped found. In 1882, Kelley attended Cornell University at age 16. There, she wrote her thesis about disadvantaged children, influenced by her father's teaching about underprivileged children. Although Kelley desired to study law at the University of Pennsylvania, she was denied to attend because of her gender. In the meantime, she pursued her passion for working women by founding and attending evening classes at the New Century Guild for Working Women. Later, she attended the University of Zurich, the first European university to grant degrees to women, and she joined a group of students advocating for socialism. Kelley also earned a law degree at Northwestern University School of Law in 1894, and she was then able to start a school for working girls in Pennsylvania. Kelley was a member of the Intercollegiate Socialist Society and an activist for women's suffrage and African American civil rights. She was a follower of Karl Marx and a friend of Frederick Engels, and her translation of the latter's The Condition of the Working Class in England into English in 1885 is still used today. She assisted with the establishment of the New Century Guild of Philadelphia, which intended to increase the quality of working and living conditions of the lower class in urban areas. The organization helped lead the battle for labor laws, such as the minimum wage and the 8-hour days, at the local, state, and federal levels. In Chicago, Kelley organized the New York Working Women's Society campaign in 1889 and 1890 to add women as officials in the Office for Factory Inspection. And by 1890, the New York legislature passed laws creating 8 new positions for women as state factory inspectors. Kelley joined the Hull House from 1891 to 1899, and this allowed her to advance in her career by providing her a network to other social organizations and an outlet to pursue the advancement of rights for working women and children. While at the Hull House, Kelley bonded with Jane Addams and Julia Lathrop, who worked together as major labor reformers. All three women were of upper middle class background and had politically active fathers. She also became friends with Grace and Edith Abbott, as well as Alice Hamilton, a professional physician specializing in preventing occupational diseases. Kelley interacted with the Chicago Women's Club under Jane Addams' sponsorship by establishing a Bureau of Women's Labor. Hull House provided Kelley the opportunity to bypass male organizations in order to pursue social activism for women, who were denied participation in formal politics at the time. She's credited with starting the social justice feminism movement as well. Frances Alice Keller was born in 1873 in Columbus, Ohio. During her childhood, her father left the family, which forced her mother to move to Michigan to work as a laundress. Keller couldn't afford to finish high school, which led her to work at a local news company where she eventually became an investigative reporter. It was there that two sisters, Mary and Frances Eddy, took notice of her and helped fund her college education. She received her law degree in 1897 from Cornell Law School and received a scholarship to study sociology and social work at the University of Chicago. It was at the University of Chicago that she wrote her first scholarly article about equality among women and men in physical education. Keller also began her study of prisons while at the University of Chicago, which would lead to her first book, Experimental Sociology, published in 1901. Keller directed the National Americanization Committee, which was the most important private organization promoting Americanization, what we might consider assimilation today, during World War I. Speaking for the NAC in 1916, she proposed to combine efficiency and patriotism in her Americanization programs. It would be more efficient, she argued, once the factory workers could all understand English, and therefore better understand orders and avoid accidents. Once Americanized, they would grasp American industrial ideals and be open to American influences and not subject only to strike agitators or foreign propagandists. The result, she argued, would transform indifferent and ignorant residents into understanding voters, to make their homes into American homes, and to establish American standards of living throughout the ethnic communities. Ultimately, she argued it would unite foreign-born and native alike in enthusiastic loyalty to our national ideals of liberty and justice. Keller focused her works on women's rights, on studying the treatment of women in education and the workforce. Keller did her work on women's rights by completing fieldwork at various locations, including studying women in prison, women in the Hull House in Chicago, women employees, and women in educational settings. In 1904, Keller published the book Out of Work, in which she discusses immigrant unemployment in the United States. Unlike African American social reformers of the time, Keller believed that enslavement made it impossible for African American women to lead moral, respectable lives. So Keller and her cohort of white reformers focused on improving recently emancipated African American women's efficiency rather than attempt to challenge the racially restrictive segregationist practices of the Northern Society. Frances Keller was secretary and treasurer of the New York State Immigration Commission in 1909 and the chief investigator for the Bureau of Industries and Immigration of New York State in 1910 to 1913. She was brought on by Theodore Roosevelt's 1912 presidential campaign to help write the Progressive Party's platform. This election marked the first time that the party had taken up immigration as a key issue. The platform promised to provide immigrants more opportunities to succeed, as well as reverse policies that neglected immigrants and their rights. Roosevelt lost the election to Woodrow Wilson, but Keller continued to fight for immigrant rights. Keller never married, but she did maintain a long-term relationship with Mary Dreer, one of two wealthy sisters who played leading roles in the progressive movement in New York. They shared a home from 1905 until Keller's death in 1952. Julia Clifford Lathrop was born in 1859 in Rockford, Illinois. Her father, a lawyer and personal friend of Abraham Lincoln, helped establish the Republican Party and served in the state legislature and Congress. Her mother was a suffragist activist in women's rights activities in Rockford and a graduate of the first class of Rockford Female Seminary. Lathrop also attended Rockford Female Seminary, where she met Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr. After 1 year, she transferred to Vassar College, developing her own multidisciplinary studies in statistics, institutional history, sociology, and community organization, and graduated in 1880. Afterwards, she worked in her father's law office, first as a secretary, and then studying the law for herself. In 1890, Lathrop moved to Chicago, where she joined Jane Addams, Ellen Gates Starr, Alzina Stevens, Edith Abbott, Grace Abbott, Florence Kelley, Mary McDowell, Alice Hamilton, SOPHONISBA Breckinridge, and other social reformers at Hull House. Lathrop ran a discussion group called the Plato Club in the early days of the House, and the women at the Hull House actively campaigned to persuade Congress to pass legislation to protect children. During the Depression years of the early 90s, Lathrop served as a volunteer investigator of relief applicants, visiting homes to document the needs of the families. In 1893, she was appointed as the first ever woman member of the Illinois State Board of Charities, beginning her lifelong work in civil service reform, advocating for the training of professional social workers and standardizing employment procedures. This would lead to opening the labor market for educated women, as well as improving social services in progressive-era cities and towns. Over the next few years, she helped introduce reforms, such as the appointment of female doctors in state hospitals and the removal of the insane from the state workhouses. In 1912, President William Taft appointed Lathrop as the first bureau chief. Over the next 9 years, she directed research into child labor, infant mortality, maternal mortality, juvenile delinquency, mothers' pensions, and illegitimacy. The Children's Bureau under Lathrop and her successors became an administrative unit that not only created child welfare policy, but also led its implementation. For many conservative women, the Bureau's focus on maternal and child welfare gave them a role in politics for the first time, something that the suffrage or women's rights movements had not offered them. The Bureau expanded its budget and personnel to focus on a scientific approach to motherhood in order to reduce infant and maternal mortality, improve child health, and advocate for trained care for children with disabilities. Lathrop modeled the Children's Bureau investigations from the work she did while at Hull House. The Bureau also lobbied to abolish child labor, and scientific language became critical to the reform efforts, such as the baby-saving campaigns in towns with large working-class and immigrant populations, where the middle-class maternalists battled contemporary beliefs in the inevitability of high infant mortality rates. In 1917, the American Association for Labor Legislation proposed a National Health Insurance Act that included a provision for weekly cash allocations for pregnant women. Lathrop went against the private insurance industry and the American Medical Association to support this proposal, believing that the maternity benefit system already in place in Germany, England, and France left too many women and their babies uninsured. Lathrop argued in an address before the American Public Health Association's 1918 meeting in Chicago that U.S. leaders needed to address the reasons for poverty in order to address children's health needs, and that infant mortality among the poor and working class in American cities was not just due to ignorance or laziness. The attitude of most of the staff in the Children's Bureau and other government agencies, however, was that women, especially with children, should not work outside of the home even if impoverished. Any connections between children's health and such issues as expansion of workers' insurance, minimum wage, or sanitation systems lost credence. The popular strategy remained focused on Americanizing immigrant workers and teaching white mothers how to take care of babies. And it's important to note that the Bureau chose not to address the horrifyingly high mortality rates among babies in families of color. In the South, much of the public health campaigns were undertaken by African American, Hispanic, or Black club women working in their own segregated communities. In 1918, President Woodrow Wilson sent Lathrop and Grace Abbott to represent the U.S. at an international conference on child welfare. There, Lathrop consulted on the formation of a child care bureau in the newly formed country of Czechoslovakia. After her retirement from the Children's Bureau in 1922, Lathrop became the president of the Illinois League of Women Voters. She also helped form the National Committee of Mental Illness, and in 1925, Lathrop represented the U.S. in Switzerland at the Child Welfare Committee established by the League of Nations. Annie Marion MACLEAN was born in 1869 in St. Peter's Bay and raised in Nova Scotia. Her father was a Baptist minister, and she received her preparatory education at the Baptist Acadia Seminary in Wolfville, Nova Scotia. She went on to study at Acadia University, then known as Acadia College, receiving her bachelor's degree in 1893 and her master's in 1894. She then immigrated to Illinois, hoping to study at the University of Chicago, which had recently been established. MACLEAN was the first woman to receive a master's degree in sociology in 1897, and the second to receive a PhD in 1900, both from the University of Chicago. Her master's thesis was on factor legislation for women in the United States, laying the groundwork for a lifetime of work studying the conditions of working women. Her dissertation dealt with another lifelong theme, immigration, and was titled The Acadian Element in the Population of Nova Scotia. As a woman, MACLEAN was largely excluded from conventional academic positions in her field. Unlike male students, she was not hired into the sociology department, even though she far surpassed the productivity of her male peers. Her initial teaching posts after her graduate study were at Royal Victoria College in Montreal, where she taught from 1900 to 1901, and at Stetson University in Florida, where she taught sociology from 1901 to 1903. She taught correspondence courses in the University of Chicago's Home Study Department from 1903 to a few months before her death in 1934. In addition, she taught as a professor of sociology at Adelphi College from 1906 to 1916, and at the YWCA National Training School from 1903 to 1916. In the Home Study Department at the U of C, MACLEAN worked alongside other notable women sociologists, including EDITH ABBOTT and SOPHONISBA Breckinridge. She taught courses on subjects including rural life, social technology, and immigration. MACLEAN was a highly sophisticated methodologist, using a pragmatic blend of methods to address the specific practical questions at hand. Her techniques included participant observation, social surveys, and social worlds. MACLEAN's research career reached its peak with a 1907 to 1908 study that she supervised under the auspices of the YWCA, using a staff of 29 women sociologists surveying 400 companies, employing a total of 135,000 women in more than 20 cities. The study led to her path-breaking work on women's employment, titled Wage-Earning Women, published in 1910. In the 1920s, ill health forced MACLEAN to retire from non-correspondence teaching. She died on May 1, 1934, at her home in Pasadena, California. She had been living there with her sister Mildred since 1925. MACLEAN's use of participant observation, which was well ahead of the time that this technique became mainstream, has earned her the title of Mother of Ethnography. However, the accuracy of this name has been disputed by scholars of her work, who note much earlier ethnographic work by Harriet Martineau. Marion Talbot was born in 1858 in Thun, Switzerland, while her parents were on a European trip, but she grew up in Boston, Massachusetts. Her mother, Emily Fairbanks Talbot, was an activist and former teacher, and her father, Israel Talbot, was dean of the Boston University School of Medicine. The lack of college preparatory universities for her daughters led Emily to establish the Boston Latin Academy, the first all-girls college preparatory academy in the United States. Talbot herself, however, was the eldest and did not benefit from that effort directly. She attended the Chapel Hill Chauncey School near Boston, and subsequently attended Boston University, where her mother had to work aggressively to secure her admission. Talbot earned a Bachelor of Arts from Chapel Hill in 1880, and a Master of Arts in 1882. She also obtained a Bachelor of Science from MIT, where she studied under domestic science pioneer Ellen Swallow Richards, who had established her own laboratory there. Talbot initially dropped out due to poor conditions for women at MIT, but completed the degree in 1888. In 1882, she and Richards co-founded the Association of Collegiate Alumnae, which in 1921 became the American Association of University Women. She was secretary of the association from its founding in 1895, and president from 1895 to 1897. From 1890 to 1892, Talbot taught domestic science at Wellesley College. In 1892, she took up the position of assistant professor in the Department of Social Science and Anthropology at the newly created University of Chicago. She also took responsibility for the education of undergraduate women as the assistant to Alice Freeman Palmer, Dean of Graduate Women. Palmer ceded the deanship to Talbot in 1895 because Palmer's position was largely ceremonial. Talbot was often considered the first Dean of Women. Talbot was appointed Dean of Women of the U of C in 1899, giving her responsibility for all women students at the university. She worked to elevate deanship as a profession, establishing the first Midwestern regional meetings of deans in 1902. Talbot was a specialist in domestic science and became head of the newly created Department of Household Administration at the University of Chicago in 1904. Her assistant in the department was SOPHONISBA BRECKINRIDGE, and Talbot co-founded the American Home Economics Association in 1908. Talbot announced her retirement from the University of Chicago in 1925. After retiring, she traveled to Turkey in 1927 to 1928 to serve as acting president of the Constantinople College for Women, returning to serve as full president in 1931 to 1932. In retirement, Talbot remained actively engaged in the affairs of the university. She died in Chicago in 1948 of chronic myocarditis, and she was buried at the Oakwood Cemetery in Chicago. The work of the women in the Chicago Women's School of Sociology was rooted in various social theories. Jane Addams based much of her thought of social reform on her theory of social justice, which is explained as the understanding of the individual as embodied, agentic, self-interested, sociable, and ethical. From this theory, we can see how the women involved in social reform at both the state and national level were empowered by this positive view of the self in society. In addition to this theory, the Chicago Women's School of Sociology also borrowed heavily from the ideas of Marxist socialism. This, in part, came from the influence of Florence KELLEY, who had studied socialism at the University of Zurich. What a majority of women believed was economic class position is the main variable explaining the human misery they saw around them, unfettered capitalist greed as the primary cause of misery. This provided the foundation of their work done in social reform. In addition, the work of the Chicago Women's School of Sociology in Chicago was embraced by many in society, as the Chicago Women's School continued to organize systems to help the poor. But socialist thought was also scorned in the United States, and oftentimes this opposition created barriers for the women involved in legislation to help disadvantaged groups. The Chicago Women's School of Sociology was not simply a group of social reformers, but a community of social scientists insistent on providing empirical evidence to demonstrate and support their theories concerning societal stress. Their methods were wide, running the spectrum of techniques from surveys, interviews, and field observation to analysis of court records, voting records, and census data. The result of these practices was that the Chicago Women's School of Sociology created many of the methodological and data-gathering strategies that would by the 1930s become criteria of male professionalized sociology. In addition, the collective work of these women in social reform later influenced a majority of the policy included in the New Deal. During the early years of the Chicago Women's School of Sociology's work, the first psychology laboratories were being set up around the United States. In fact, the University of Chicago set up laboratories in 1893 under the direction of Charles Augustus Strong. An overwhelming amount of these laboratories were run by men who clearly favored the presence of male scholars over women scholars. If one considers these conditions, the significance of the Chicago Women's School of Sociology's contributions to social theory and reform were impressive, even if the individuals who contributed to its body are virtually unknown. It's been proposed that when the vocational realities of women's lives are either ignored or classified as exceptional, they are not able to function as models for the next generations. Although many do not know of the Chicago Women's School of Sociology's monumental contributions to governmental policy and social reform, they're nonetheless living in a society of ideas and institutions patterned after their theory. While made up of many women who did not necessarily share the exact same ideas, the textbook authors identify three themes in the theoretical arguments of the Chicago Women's School of Sociology. The first theme is that the subject of sociology is the systematic social arrangements producing human pain. Each of the theorists in the Chicago Women's School emphasized the explanation of social problems through individual examples of human pain, demonstration that pain occurs in patterns rather than randomly, the investigation of structural causes of inequity and suffering, and the determination to produce remedies. First, the theorists in the Chicago Women's School used individual examples of human suffering to speak to larger social problems. What we now consider to be qualitative sociology, the Chicago Women's School sociologists illustrate their sociological arguments by weaving together observations and narratives of those in society who exhibit the most individual and collective pain. Second, the Chicago Women's School sociologists showed how individual pain was actually part of a collective pattern, and they explained this pain through the intersection of race, class, gender, ethnicity, and age. They demonstrated this through individual but representative or typical biographies, such as the working class child, the elderly working class woman, or the immigrant man trying to provide for a family. They utilized maps, statistics, photographs, and words to portray the quality of life in various neighborhoods, and showed the correlation between pain and social class, skill level, immigrant status, language, and cultural barriers. Third, the Chicago women investigated the structural causes of inequality and the pain that they witnessed. They firmly believed that all social conditions are interrelated: industry, family, gender, education, household, factory, government, and so on. They first observed the condition of human pain and then showed its causes and consequences in society. They identified 3 general structural arrangements that cause pain: the workings of the industrial order under capitalism, the patterning of access by discriminatory practices, and a maladjustment between the processes of production and the ethical responsiveness of the community. The second theme is that the method of sociology is the use of multiple research strategies to achieve empirically accurate accounts of socially produced human pain. 4 aspects of the research of the Chicago women are particularly noteworthy: a willingness to start from the immediate lived experience, the use of multiple research strategies to explore a given issue, a critical attitude toward both the data collected and the ethical implications of the research design, and a vivid and accessible presentation of data in which the researchers keep themselves present to their readers. The Chicago women sought to create methods that would give them empirically grounded, generalizable information that they could use to formulate policy initiatives. And one of their lasting achievements is the variety of data gathering techniques that they pioneered. They often invented their research procedures as they went along, and they brought into the research area their own experiences as citizens living ordinary lives. The third theme is that the duty of the sociologist is to use research to mobilize the people and the state for reform of inequitable social arrangements. For the Chicago women, the people and the state were the most important actors that needed to be mobilized in order to change the social conditions producing pain. They related to the people by appealing to their self-interest and their conscience. They utilized the ideology of the consumer to relate to uniform legislation regarding labor regulations. Since the US Constitution forbids any state to deny the import of goods from any other, they decided to use governmental statistic reports to identify manufacturers who were in violation of labor regulations. The most important feature of this work, however, was the power of association. So they needed to convince large numbers of people to form a unity of demand that would be large enough to affect the manufacturers. They also challenged the public versus private ideology by using empirical studies to show the interrelatedness of public and private life, and argued that both the public was affected by private life and that private life was affected by the public. Finally, they lobbied for reform through government, as they believed that the state had a role in social amelioration. They believed that the state can and will act responsibly if government agencies are energized, mobilized, and monitored by concerned citizen associations, if social science research is used in the formation of strategies for reform, and if there is open, accessible communication among agencies, public citizens, and social scientists.